For nearly 4 decades, John Gottman watched couples argue. In a laboratory apartment wired to electrocardiographs and skin conductance sensors, their every glance and sigh coded second by second. With his lifelong collaborator Robert Levinson, he could predict with unsettling accuracy which couples would still be together years later. And yet something was missing. Prediction, as he puts it, is not the same as understanding. This is a summary of The Science of Trust, Emotional Attunement for Couples, published in 2011 by W. W. Norton. It is Gottman's attempt to name and measure the thing his earlier work had circled without capturing. The quality reporters kept pressing him about when they asked, "What about magic? What about chemistry?" His answer, arrived at through focus groups with low-income couples expecting a baby, was trust, and his method for pinning it down was borrowed from an unlikely source. The two-person game theory John von Neumann developed for the mathematics of nuclear war. What follows moves through the book as Gottman built it, from the laboratory findings that preceded the question, through the mathematics of a trust metric, into the physiology of betrayal, and finally to the practical blueprints by which ordinary couples either build trust or let it erode. It is written for clinicians, but its subject is something every person in a committed relationship recognizes. The quiet, cumulative answer to the question, "Are you there for me?" Chapter 1. Why a Book on Trust? Gottman opens with a transcript, a husband and wife trying to talk about distance since the baby arrived. She says she feels lonely. He proposes solutions, a bike, the gym, a plan, and, meaning to encourage her, remarks that she used to have a cute rear end. The conversation collapses, both heart rates over 100 beats a minute. His point is not that the husband is cruel, but that he listens the way he listens at a staff meeting, hunting for a fix, while she is asking to be understood. Understanding must precede problem-solving, and the failure to grasp that is a skill deficit, not a character flaw. He explains why he began with description rather than theory. As a young professor, he set out to help friendless children make friends, and discovered developmental psychologists did not actually know how children made friends. It took him 13 years to find out. His former student Martha Putalaz showed that the standard advice, walking up and announcing your name, is close to a guaranteed way for a preschooler to get rejected. The lesson, intervention built on imagination, fails. Trained at Wisconsin in the tradition of Harlow's primate work, Gottman took from Jim Sackett a technique called lag sequence analysis and turned it on married couples, dividing them into the masters and the disasters. From that came his list of what goes wrong. The ratio of positive to negative affect during conflict runs about 5-to-1 in stable relationships and below 1-to-1 in couples heading for divorce. Escalation marked by the 4 horsemen, criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling, predicts divorce at an average of 5.6 years. The different pattern of emotional disengagement predicts it at 16.2 years. Couples turn away from bids, fail at repair, and slide into what Robert Weiss called negative sentiment override, in which, as Robinson and Price found, partners miss half the positive behavior outside observers record. Against these, he sets the 7 signs of health and corrects the field along the way. Rausch's 3 conflict styles, validators, avoiders, volatiles, all work if the 5-to-1 ratio holds, and active listening, he found, received no support in his data and is rarely done even in happy marriages. 69% of what couples argue about is perpetual, rooted in personality. A point he draws from Dan Weil's observation that choosing a partner is choosing a set of unsolvable problems. The theory built to explain all this is the sound relationship house, 7 levels rising from love maps, fondness and admiration, and turning toward bids. Through the positive perspective, managing conflict, making life dreams come true, and creating shared meaning. But the house made a troubling implicit claim that any 2 people applying its 7 principles could build a happy relationship. Running focus groups with lower-income couples, Gottman and his wife Julie Schwartz. Gottman heard the same word again and again. The missing foundation was trust, and its shadow, betrayal. Chapter 2. The Trust Metric. The Declaration of Interdependence. Before defining trust, Gottman surveys how large the question is. Social capital research finds that 2% of Brazilians say people can be trusted against 65% of Norwegians, and that low-trust regions have worse health, lower voting, and more crime. Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone made the field. But trust means something different in each discipline. Behavioral in James Coleman's sociology, developmental in Erik Erikson's psychology, grounded in attachment by Bowlby, Ainsworth, and Harlow, whose rhesus infants preferred a cloth mother's contact comfort to a wire mother's milk. Gottman's own lineage runs through Thibault and Kelly's interdependence theory and Carol Rusbolt's investment model. His complaint about the whole literature is precision. Trust has never been measured within a single interaction. Game theory supplies the frame. Gottman quotes Colin Camera, "Would you lend money to someone who doesn't have to repay you? If yes, you trust her. If she repays, she is trustworthy." He describes a study Harold Kelly ran with 100 couples on who cleans the apartment and notices that each partner's payoffs change more when the other changes behavior. There is the first clue. Trust can be defined as the extent to which our partner's change in behavior raises our payoffs. He contrasts the conservative von Neumann-Morgenstern saddle point in the cleaning matrix, neither cleans, with the more optimistic Nash equilibrium, both clean, one expecting the worst, the other the best. To fill the cells with real numbers, he uses his specific affect coding system, reduced with programmer Tara Madhyastha to 3 categories he calls nasty, neutral, and nice, plus a rating dial on which each partner re-watches the tape and scores their own experience. The findings are the heart of the chapter. In the nice and neutral cells, couples behave rationally, more of what pays better. He calls the neutral cell the Cinderella cell, the ignored stepsister no therapy celebrates, and reports that over 20 years, couples who stayed together drifted toward more neutrality during conflict. But in the nasty cell, rationality collapses. Unhappy couples rate these exchanges far worse than happy couples do, yet perform them far more often. Hidden Markov modeling showed why. For unhappy couples, negativity is an absorbing state, easier to enter than to leave. What Gottman likens to a roach motel and Dan Weil to a bog where each partner feels too stung to do anything but sting back. Camera's behavioral game theory gives the vocabulary. Ultimatum experiments show people rejecting money to punish unfairness. Gottman then states his metric, her trusting him, means that without regard for his own gains, he can be counted on to change his behavior to raise her payoffs out of nasty exchanges. It is behavioral, not cognitive, and a property of an interaction, not a person. Validated in the lab, it holds, when he trusts her, she is more satisfied, and he is calmer physiologically. When she trusts him, she reports less aggression, less abuse, less violence, and fewer thoughts of divorce. Trust, he argues, raises a relationship's threshold for what mathematicians call the cusp of a catastrophe, permits action on incomplete information, and lowers transaction costs, the way Orthodox Jewish diamond merchants exchange fortunes on a handshake. Chapter 3. The Metrics of Untrustworthiness and Betrayal. To extend the metrics, Gottman detours through the lives of 2 game theorists who drew opposite conclusions from the same mathematics. John von Neumann designed the implosion mechanism for the Nagasaki bomb, built one of the first computers, reformulated quantum mechanics, and proved the Minimax theorem, a prodigy who, as his biographer Steve Himes records, believed in pleasure but not emotional attachment. He was also the architect of Rand's nuclear strategy and an open advocate of a preventive first strike on the Soviet Union. He was the model for Dr. Strangelove, and Gottman's point is that the film was not an exaggeration. Anatole Rappaport was the mirror image, a concert pianist turned peace researcher who, watching his father's grocer's agreement collapse the moment one defected, coined the phrase the invisible back of the hand for situations where everyone's pursuit of advantage produces a collective bad. He divided conflict into 3 modes: fights, which are systemic and irrational. Lewis Richardson had modeled the pre-war arms build-up with differential equations, no rationality assumption required. Games, rationally conducted conflicts where the goal is to outwit rather than eliminate. And debates, conflicts open to persuasion, labor negotiations, and marriages. His life's work was The Prisoner's Dilemma, and his tit-for-tat strategy won Axelrod's 1984 tournament. From this, Gottman derives untrustworthiness, the mirror of trust. She believes he can be counted on to raise his own payoffs without regard for hers. The two metrics turn out to be statistically independent. High trust can coexist with high untrustworthiness. And such couples, contrary to his prediction of jealousy, proved simply to be newer relationships still testing whether betrayal would come. Returning to his 130 Seattle newlyweds, he found nearly every conflict was, underneath, a trust test. Can I trust you to choose me over your friends? To be faithful? Betrayal itself gets the simplest measure. The correlation between the partners' rating dial curves. When they slope oppositely, the interaction is zero-sum. His gain is literally her loss. He illustrates with two older couples. Couple 438, arguing about a refinanced house, whose curves slope apart and who spend 88% of the time in nasty. And couple 458, negotiating a hearing aid with laughter, whose curves move in synchrony and who spend 62% in neutral. Chapter 4. The Physiology of Trust and Betrayal. Why is the nasty cell so sticky? Gottman's answer is flooding, a concept he takes from Paul Ekman and illustrates with Hurricane Katrina. People who felt safe as the water seeped in and did not panic until it crossed a terrifying threshold. Flooded people are not calculating payoffs. They are in a state of self-preservation, heart rates reaching 168 beats a minute in a comfortable chair. He defines the four horsemen precisely, noting that criticism's first attribution, selfish, is exactly a violation of the trust metric, that contempt has a universal facial signature, the dimpler produced by the left buccinator, and that contempt is his single best predictor of divorce, predicting even the number of a wife's infectious illnesses over 4 years. The physiology is spelled out. Diffuse physiological arousal begins with inhibition of the vagus nerve, the heart speeding within a single beat. Adrenaline past 100 beats per minute, the frontal lobes ceding ground to the amygdala. Because the stress neurotransmitters have no degrading enzymes and must diffuse through the blood, Gottman insists a break must last at least 20 minutes and not be spent rehearsing distress. In Amber Tabares's experiment, only the husbands who genuinely lowered their heart rates used fewer horsemen afterward. Steve Porges's analysis of heart period variability supplies the measure of vagal tone, which Gottman notes is trainable rather than genetic. Then the findings that give the book its stakes. James Cone's fMRI work showed that a happily married woman anticipating a shock has her brain's alarm circuitry nearly shut down when her husband holds her hand. A stranger's hand produces full activation. Oxytocin studies, Sue Carter's Prairie Voles, the Swiss investment game, suggest a hormonal substrate for trust. Though a Haifa study found that in a zero-sum game, oxytocin made subjects gloat and envy, a warning that in a zero-sum relationship, even the hormone of trust may build suspicion. The epidemiology is starker. Berkman and Symes' Alameda County study found the survivors were those with friends or marriages. Multiplying his trust metric by time in the nasty cell, Gottman found a correlation of 0.85 between the wife's trust metric and slower blood velocity in both partners, and none with the husbands. How much she trusts him is what matters physiologically to both. And in the 20-year study, the death rate was 58.3% for zero-sum couples against 22.8% for cooperative ones. Controlling for age and health, a zero-sum conflict raised a husband's odds of dying 11-fold. The husbands were the ones dying. Chapter 5. When it's time to bail out of a relationship. Gottman wants an expiration date for relationships and claims to have found one. It comes from the oral history interview, an instrument he and Lowell Krokoff spent more than 2 years developing, modeled partly on the sociologist Fred Strotbeck and partly on the radio interviewer Studs Terkel, whose technique produced long, uninterrupted monologues. Couples are asked how they met, what their first impressions were, how they decided this was the person, and what distinguishes a good marriage from a bad one. The interview matters because memory is not a recording. Citing Lewis, Amini, and Lannon, Gottman describes it as continually rewritten by current experience. With Kim Buellman, he developed 5 coding dimensions. The fondness and admiration system captures whether the couple's story of one another is warm, or sour. We-ness versus me-ness tracks the pronouns, and Levinson's computerized counting of we, us, our against I, me, mine correlates with happiness. The love map dimension distinguishes couples who recall the past vividly from those who answer with a long pause. The fourth separates chaos from purpose and meaning. The fifth separates disappointment from satisfaction, its clearest marker the advice they would give a young couple: wait, just don't do it. The finding is that these dimensions collapse onto a single factor, accounting for more than 80% of the variance, which Gottman calls the story of us switch. It behaves like a switch rather than a dial. Either the couple emphasizes the good and minimizes the bad, or the reverse, and coding it predicted divorce or stability over 4 years with 94% accuracy. He answers the base rate objection directly. Only 17 of 130 newlyweds divorced within 6 years, and drawing 94% of those from an earn of 130 has a probability on the order of 10 to the minus 19th. What flips the switch is not whether bad things happened. His illustration is Marla and Billy, married at 18, whose disastrous first year gave way after a forced move to Utah to a story told without a grudge. Because having no one else, they had to become friends who could talk about their fights. Once the switch goes negative, it is very hard to move. A partner's sudden kindness registers only as the demon doing something nice for a change. Chapter 6. How Couples Build Trust with Attunement. This is the longest chapter and the practical core. Couples describe trust along 2 dimensions: transparency and a positive moral certainty that the partner is good and has us near the center of his motivational scheme. Trust is tested in 3 contexts. Gottman pictures as sections of a folding fan: the tiny everyday sliding door moments, the processing of regrettable incidents and conflict discussions. The skill that meets these tests came from the meta-emotion interview Gottman designed in 1985, How We Feel About Feelings. It produced remarkable material, like the woman who at 8 made a pact with her sisters to convert all sadness into anger, and now, when her 4-year-old is sad, goes for a run. 2 philosophies emerged. Emotion-dismissing parents treat negative affect as toxic and try to distract the child out of it. Gottman insists this is not cruelty, and that coding showed warmth to be independent of the dismissing coaching dimension. Emotion coaching parents notice the emotion early, empathize, help the child name it, and set limits on behavior while accepting the feeling. Chaim Ginot's formula that all feelings are acceptable, but not all behavior is. Coached children in his longitudinal sample had higher achievement controlling for earlier IQ, better attentional control and self-soothing, fewer behavior problems, and fewer infectious illnesses. But Yoon Nam's dissertation complicates the picture. Korean-American children of largely dismissing, shame-based parents outperformed on a task while showing significantly higher depression. Because coaching implies asymmetry, Gottman generalized it into attunement, using Dan Yoshimoto's extension of the interview to couples. Attune is an acronym: awareness, turning toward, tolerance of 2 valid realities, understanding, non-defensive listening, and empathy. Awareness includes keeping in mind what Tom Bradbury calls enduring vulnerabilities. Gottman has clients imagine each person wearing a T-shirt listing theirs. Turning toward burdens the speaker. Complaints must be converted into positive needs, because within every negative emotion is a longing and therefore a recipe. In sadness, something is missing. In anger, a goal is blocked. In loneliness, a desire for connection. Non-defensive listening he considers the hardest of the 6, harder than empathy. Each of the 3 contexts gets a blueprint. Sliding door moments take their name from the Gwyneth Paltrow film. Gottman's own example is finding his wife looking sad in the mirror, the universe in which he backs out to read his novel, and the one in which he takes the hairbrush from her hand. Janice Driver's coding of bids produced the book's most quoted statistic. Couples divorced 6 years after the wedding had turned toward each other 33% of the time, those still married, 86%. For regrettable incidents, Gottman offers a small proof that they are inevitable. If each partner is available half the time, both are available only a quarter of the time, and names the mechanism of damage the Zeigarnik effect, after Bloomer Zeigarnik, who watched Vienna waiters carry huge orders flawlessly and forget them the moment they were filled. Unprocessed events are rehearsed until cognitive dissonance is resolved by attributing lasting negative traits to the partner. The most common is selfish, which is a decline in the trust metric, and enough of it flips the oral history switch. The remedy is the 6-step aftermath procedure. Name feelings, describe both realities without blame, accept responsibility, identify triggers, tell the story behind each, make constructive plans. Moving in Dan Weil's terms, from attack-defend through admitting into collaborative mode. For conflict itself, the Gottman-Rappaport blueprint adapts Rappaport's rule that persuasion must wait until each can state the other's position and adds a constraint on the speaker, since a harsh start produces defensive sequences even in happy couples. The chapter closes with paired transcripts, Bill and Diane, Fred and Angel, whose housework argument collapses into "Hold on, shut up," followed by Gottman's rewritten version showing how close they came, and the attuned new parents, George and Judy. Chapter 7. How Couples Build Intimate Trust. In the Middle Ages, marriage was about property. The word uxorious was coined to mock the fool in love with his own wife. The modern expectation that one relationship be loyal, stable, and erotic is new, and some argue it is incoherent. Helen Fisher treats being in love and loving as separate chemical systems. Gottman proposes they can be one state, intimate trust. His central disagreement is with Esther Perel's claim that separateness is the condition of desire. His objection is empirical. His transition to parenthood research found that for couples whose sex life was still good 3 years on, intimate trust, affection, intimate conversation, and good sex were one continuum. They had sex with the flannel nightgown on. Bernie Zilbergeld's study of couples over 45 found that what distinguished good sex lives from bad was not technique, but a close, trusting friendship and making sex a priority. Separateness, Gottman notes dryly, is not what couples lack after a baby. It arrives free of charge. He distinguishes personal from impersonal sex, adopting Viktor Frankl's definition of pornography as impersonal sex, and reframes sexual dysfunction historically. Masters and Johnson defined the phases of the sexual response and thereby, he argues, made sex like a game of chess, which necessarily created standards of competence and with them performance anxiety. Shareheight's survey found that 70% of her women would not have qualified for that study, and that what impeded their sex lives was their partner's adherence to the standard model. Gottman calls the implication revolutionary. If everything partners do physically counts as sex, most dysfunctions dissolve, and what remains is the ability to talk about it. He supports the argument with Sidney Girard's counts of dinner table touch, 115 times an hour in Paris, 0 in London, and Tiffany Field's finding that massaged premature infants gained 47% of body weight in 10 days. The chapter's emblem is a Kinsey Institute film of 2 porcupines. The male sits facing the female and strokes her face until her quills lower. Chapter 8. The Importance of Repairing Negativity During Conflict. Repair, Gottman argues, is the single most important process a long-term relationship needs, and the model comes from infancy. Edward Tronick found mothers and their 3-month-olds miscoordinated 70% of the time, and that the mothers who noticed and repaired the miscoordination had securely attached infants. Janice Driver and Amber Tabarez spent 7 years building a coding system that sorts repairs into cognitive ones, which appeal to logic, and affective ones, which create closeness, +2 that surprise clinicians. Topic change, coded as a repair because it lowers arousal, and damaged repairs, attempts sabotaged by a hostile tag. The results are lopsided. Cognitive repairs were generally ineffective. Repairs aimed at emotional closeness worked broadly. Humor, affection, agreement, self-disclosure, and especially taking responsibility for even part of the problem. Timing mattered. Preemptive repair in the first 3 minutes worked. Repair at the 11th hour barely at all. And the strongest finding concerned the recipient. Acceptance of a repair predicted the outcome far more than the attempt itself. What predicted acceptance was measured entirely outside the conflict. The partners turning toward bids during a dinnertime segment and their weeness in the oral history interview. Gottman's grim companion finding is that only 4% of couples who began a conversation negatively managed to turn it around. The way out is not better technique inside the fight, but a larger emotional bank account outside it, the difference between arguing with a temporarily annoying friend and a permanently hostile adversary. Chapter 9. The Dynamics of Betrayal. Gottman opens with a payoff matrix scored in years of life. Trusting a trustworthy partner is worth roughly 15 years. Trusting an untrustworthy one costs 4 to 8, drawing on Howard Friedman's follow-up of Terman's gifted children cohort. Refusing to trust the trustworthy, lifelong loneliness costs about 10. The counterintuitive conclusion is that the risk of betrayal is smaller than the risk of never risking. He offers 5 criteria for assessing trustworthiness: honesty, transparency, accountability, ethics, and alliance, and 1 heuristic. If someone answers a specific inquiry with, "Just trust me, be suspicious." The theoretical engine is Carol Rusbolt, who died in 2010 and whose work Gottman treats as a legacy. She measured what Thibault and Kelly never did: the comparison level for alternatives, the payoffs we imagine we might receive elsewhere, and showed that commitment is a gradual process of favorable comparisons, and her investment model predicted infidelity prospectively. Gottman's contribution is a pair of names: cherishing, thinking fondly of the partner when apart, and magnifying gratitude, which builds a fence around other liaisons. He notes sacrifice shares a root with sacred, and trashing, its mirror. From this he draws a careful distinction. Susan Johnson's attachment injuries are the atom of distrust, but the atom of betrayal is more specific, turning away from a bid while simultaneously making an unfavorable comparison to a real or imagined alternative. What escalates it into a pattern is conflict avoidance. Drawing on Shirley Glass's Not Just Friends, Gottman describes how affairs begin: a good conversation with a colleague, a fleeting thought that one no longer talks to one's partner that way, and the decision not to mention it because it would start an argument. That decision creates a secret, a wall between the partners and a window to the outsider. Glass's architecture reversed, and the damage is done first to the person keeping the secret, whose capacity to love is constrained. He lists a dozen ways to betray a partner besides sex, and closes with an asymmetry. Because negative affect is a principal mechanism of repair, a woman's ability to actually influence her husband when she is upset is her safety from betrayal. Chapter 10. Healing from Betrayal. Can a clinician tell whether trust can be rebuilt? Gottman thinks he has a test, discovered accidentally in Amber Tabarez's dissertation. Between 2 conflict discussions, couples were assigned to praise their partner using positive traits, complain using negative ones, or read magazines. Many in the praise condition converted it into criticism. "I had trouble finding 3 positive traits, so I picked 3 I wish you had." While many in the complain condition converted it into affection, and the predictor of which way a couple went was the wife's untrustworthiness metric. Gottman proposes the exercise as an untrustworthiness detector. For the rebuilding, he returns to game theory. Axelrod's tournaments made Rapoport's tit-for-tat the best strategy in clean conditions. Then Axelrod introduced noise, the possibility of honest mistakes, and found that over many generations contrition, cooperating after the other defects in response to one's own defection, proved most effective. Gottman adds a rule from the Diamond Merchants Network. Subsequent betrayal must carry severe cost, which he prefers to frame, with Mnuchin, as responsibility for the partner's welfare. On forgiveness, he draws on Solomon Schimmel's wounds not healed by time, accepting that some injuries are deep enough that forgiving would damage the betrayed, and cites Borkum's and Christensen's trials showing couples dealing with a known affair start lower but finish in the same place as other distressed couples. His practical answer is a 3-phase model. The betrayer listens without defense, the therapist's worst error being to allow blame shifting in the name of balance, and establishes transparency. The couple reverses the betrayal processes with the Gottman-Rapoport blueprint and the habit of cherishing, and they rebuild intimate trust through personal sex. The chapter ends with a survey of pornography research, including Patrick Carnes's SAFE acronym: sexual addiction as secret, abusive, avoidant of pain, and empty of committed relationship. Chapter 11. The Mathematics of Relationships: Power Imbalance, Trust, and Betrayal. The final chapter answers scholars like Russell Hardin, who argued that large power differences undercut trustworthiness. Finding the existing literature contradictory, Gottman went to mathematics, a patient walk through 15 years of work with the mathematical biologist James Murray, whose lineage runs back to von Bertalanffy's general system theory and its differential equations. The model needed two interlocking equations, one per partner, and it took Gottman 4 years to supply the influence functions. His theory was minimal. Negativity has more power to hurt than positivity has to heal. So the influence line is steeper in the negative range. Each partner's side has a constant and a term he added while Murray was on vacation: emotional inertia. Unhappy couples had more negative constants and more inertia before influence even began. Solving the equations yields steady states, and the results are striking. Couples who would end up happy had, at first measurement, a force field with a single positive attractor. Miserable but stable couples, a single negative attractor. Divorcing couples, 3 negative attractors. The fields did not merely predict the outcomes, they explained them, and could model sudden catastrophic collapse when a couple's baseline drifts past a critical threshold. On the question that prompted the enterprise, the finding is unambiguous. When the husband held more power with negative affect, the marriage showed more gender stereotypy and less effective repair. And the wife's sheer power with negative affect correlated at -0.54 with the betrayal metric. Epilogue. Gottman closes with a baker's dozen of contributions. That trust, trustworthiness, and betrayal can be measured in a single interaction. That game theory's rationality assumption fails in the negative cell because negativity is an absorbing state of flooding and low trust. That high trust has a distinct physiology. That the zero-sum betrayal metric predicted early husband death across 20 years. That attunement builds trust in 3 contexts and can be taught. That repairs acceptance matters more than its form. That betrayal and loyalty follow describable cascades, and that power imbalance seriously compromises trust. Closing. What a listener carries away is a reframing of intimacy as something measurable without being reducible. Gottman has taken the mathematics designed to model a first strike on Moscow and pointed it at a couple arguing about the dishes, and what he finds there is not cold. It is that a wife's trust of her husband slows the blood in both their bodies. That a husband whose conflicts run as zero-sum games is 11 times likelier to die within 20 years. That 100% of men who reported no warmth from either parent were seriously ill by midlife. The book's quiet argument is that we are not built to be sovereign consumers of one another. We are built for communion, and the body registers its absence as injury. The practical core is smaller and more demanding than the mathematics suggests. It is the moment in the bathroom doorway when a man can pick up a hairbrush or walk to his book. Attunement, Gottman insists, is not complex. It is simply unnatural and requires deciding to do it. That is an old truth arriving by an unfamiliar road. That love is less a feeling than a practice. That the small refusals accumulate into a story we then mistake for the truth about another soul. And that the discipline of turning toward is what keeps that story honest. Where the book strains is in what its instruments cannot reach. Covenant, vow. The reason 2 people should stay when the payoff matrix says otherwise. Gottman gestures at it when he notes that sacrifice and sacred share a root, and then, being a scientist, moves on. The full case is worth reading in his own words. The transcripts alone repay the time.